creature. It's my great pleasure, whilst you're last of you finding a seat, to welcome Jonathan Lazar, who I have known for many, many years, who is from the University of Maryland. I did use ChatGPT to summarize all what he's done.
Oh, no.
But I actually think it's better to tell an anecdote about Jonathan than to read what you could probably just find out. It's on his first slide anyway, that he has a PhD and he's from the University of Maryland, but he's currently visiting fellow at University of Cambridge, where he's doing another degree. And he did a degree somewhere else in law. So he's a 3 degrees soon to be person. But Jonathan, I've known since he joined University of Maryland, and one of my co-authors, who you might know, Jenny Priest, he had a conversation with. And unlike all the other people at the University of Maryland, when he said he does this and he does that and he uses this method and that, she said, great. Whereas everyone else would say, but why don't you just do one thing? And so through that meeting, I got to know Jonathan, and he, as you all know, works on accessibility, but he's also written a very good book on research methods in HCI. And also, as part of our textbook, you might know that on the website, we have an accompanying site. And we interview people at each CHI unwittingly. And we've done that for 15 years. And I think, Nadia, you're from about 10 years ago, so check it out. But anyway, you were from 2018. And he was wearing a University of Penn State sweatshirt, which is where he did his second degree. And his enthusiasm was just unbelievable about how wonderful HCI is. But more to the point and prescient was he said, we need to, collaborate more with AI because that's going to be the future. And I think at that point I shall stop because I can carry on telling lots of stories about him. But I would just like to welcome Jonathan, who's going to talk about methods and tools for born accessible design. So over to you. Thank
Wonderful. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm excited to be here today with all of you, with many friends who I've known for years and new friends as well. So today I'm going to talk about methods and tools for born accessible design. Now, let's just start out with defining what we mean when we say digital accessibility. What we mean, is there a way to turn that beeping sound off for the door? Okay, great, because there are going to be another 1,000 people coming and it'll just be distracting. A person with it, when we talk about digital accessibility, what we mean is that a person with a disability can secure the same information and engage in the same transactions as someone without a disability with a substantially equivalent ease of use. And that's really important, substantially equivalent ease of use. And I want to mention this is collaborative work involving a number of colleagues from Adobe, both the product division and the research division, RIT, Shippensburg, Towson University, University of Maryland, the US Access Board, and the GSA. So MJ, Yalpi, Rick, Rajiv, Alexa, Gareth, Brian, Heidi, Baron, Abanov, Rachel, Kathy, and Andrew. Don't leave anyone out because this is a big team effort. There's a lot going on this topic. So overall structure for my presentation, I'm going to talk about the background for born accessible design, what it means, the demand for born accessible design, methods for born accessible design, and tools for born accessible design. So let's talk about the background. You often hear that inaccessible digital technology is a barrier to inclusion in education, health, employment, and commerce, and civic engagement until the technology is remediated, right? You've all heard that, right? Yes? Here's my question. Why are we saying until the technology is remediated? Why are we building something and then saying we're going to go back and fix it? Does that make sense? So there was a great article a few years ago in ACM Interactions from Elizabeth Churchill called Putting Accessibility First, and where she talks about this, building inaccessible technology or content and then remediating it is not an effective approach. Why would we build something and then go back and fix it? You wouldn't build a new building without ramps and wide enough doorways and then wait till you get a complaint, right? And then go back and fix it, right? If we are building something new, if we are adding something, we want to build from the start to be accessible, right? Because it wouldn't make sense to do it any other way. Here's an example of why this wouldn't make sense to do it that way, right? So the US Department of Labor, right? They put in a request to get a waiver from accessibility requirements. So in the US, they requested a waiver. They said, we don't have any people with disabilities, right, who might use this software. So we should be able to purchase inaccessible software. Does that make sense? That then serves as a barrier to hiring anyone with a disability for that role in the future, right? That doesn't make any sense because even if the technology gets fixed or remediated, that wait, that delay, right, is a form of societal discrimination. When people without disabilities have access and people with disabilities don't, that wait, that delay is a form of societal discrimination. And also, right, if you say, well, we're going to build something and we're going to go back afterwards and fix it, that idea of we'll fix it later, which is the more expensive way to do accessibility, that leads to the perception that accessibility is expensive, right? So people often say, I've heard accessibility is expensive. Well, yeah, if you build it and then you have to go back later and fix it and you can't find the original people that were involved and the code is messy and that maybe will be a little bit more expensive, but that's because of the way it was built. So if you've ever heard the statistic that accessibility can cause the amount of software code to double in size, that's not born accessible, that's remediation. That's going back after the fact. And we were talking about this earlier at lunch. You know, one of the challenges, let's say you're creating content. The content creator creating the content at that moment is going to be the most knowledgeable about the content. If you think about someone coming in a year later who is different, trying to remediate content, what does this image mean? How do I do? Even just the knowledge dissipates over time, right? So you want to have the most knowledgeable person at the moment make it accessible. It's not that all this extra code is due to accessibility. It's because you're retrofitting it. Retrofitting is the wrong way to do accessibility. It's not the most elegant or innovative design solution, and procuring or building inaccessible technology leads to future discrimination because you then require that someone with a disability will have to advocate. They'll have to push for a fix. Maybe they'll have to file a lawsuit. Why would we do this? Why would we design this way? Yet this is still how we build most technologies. We don't think we have any people with disabilities. You know, if we get a lawsuit, we'll go back and fix it. If we get a government complaint, why are we building technologies this way? It doesn't make sense. Now, there's a great quote from the president of the Royal Academy of Engineering here in the UK. And he says, applying a product lens, I know from my experience that we simply perform better, more impactful engineering and build better products for all communities if our engineering teams incorporate diverse users. So if you want to build accessible products, you need to involve people with disabilities in the development. It's all about excellence in product design. And again, it's the president of the Royal Academy of Engineering. His name happens to be Sir John Lazar. So if you don't believe this John Lazar, please believe the president of the Royal Academy of Engineering, Sir John Lazar. He has so many brilliant insights. I love hearing him speak. So this idea of born accessible, it ensures that people with disabilities have access at the same time. It leads to lower costs for accessibility, and it's also innovative. You've probably seen many things that are retrofitted in your physical spaces where you think, oh, that doesn't look that good. The best, most elegant, most innovative way to do accessibility is through a born accessible approach. Now, you might look online and say, you know, I searched on born accessible, and mostly what I found was from Benetech. So we actually haven't defined very well what born accessible means in terms of an interactive technology approach. Where we have defined it well is book publishers. Book publishers such as Benetech, so when you search, you'll find mostly about book publishers. They talk about born accessible meaning when they publish a book, which of course starts in digital format, they publish it in paper version, print version, at the same time that they publish it in an accessible digital version. So usually when you search about born accessible, you'll see publishers. However, right, that doesn't help us really address how to do interactive technologies and digital content that change a lot over time. And I also want to note that we want the world to move more towards a born accessible approach for any digital technologies and content from here on out. However, we can't say stop studying remediation. Why? Because as an example, there are 1 trillion PDF documents out there that are inaccessible and already exist. So we still need remediation solutions. So keep working on solutions for remediation. But for anything that's newly being built or created or new content, we want to move towards a born accessible approach. Now, these are the concepts of born accessible. In the next step, I'm going to talk about the need or the demand for born accessible design. And this work on born accessible design, right here I've got a cover from Ben Schneiderman's book, The New ABCs of Research. And he has a chapter called Choose Actionable Problems That Address Civic, Business, and Global Priorities. And born accessible design is one of those. Why? The challenge is that legal frameworks are requiring, and disability rights activists are demanding, a methodology called born accessible design. But of course, many of you here are from an HCI background, and you know that born accessible design is not really a method that's defined in the literature. We haven't fleshed out what that means. We don't have tools for it. And so right now we have an interesting situation where there are legal requirements and there are advocacy demands for this thing called born accessible design. We as an HCI community need to figure out, what does that mean? How do we implement it? What are the tools? What are the methods? What are the life cycles? We need a whole toolbox to work on born accessible design. So, for instance, if you look at the new regulations under the Accessible Canada Act, right? The consultations with disability rights groups talked about that they want accessibility being an integral part of the ICT life cycle. It's not just complying with the set of accessibility standards, which maybe don't make a product or service automatically accessible. So those were the consultations. The regulatory impact analysis talks about these would help support accessibility improvements and enable a shift to a culture where digital technology is designed to be accessible from the start. Sounds like born accessible, right? Now, the challenge is they're saying these things. Some policies have the phrase born accessible, some don't, but they're getting at this. Again, right? Ensuring digital accessibility from the start, right? The regulations, the regulatory impact analysis talk about that the burden is often placed on persons with disabilities to demonstrate that a digital product or service is inaccessible. This is what I'm talking about, the remediation. Some of my colleagues have called this an accessibility tax, that you ask people with disabilities to demand and advocate simply to get what people without disabilities already get access to, right? So again, shift the culture to one where digital technology is designed to be accessible from the start, from the regulatory impact analysis on the new Accessible Canada regulations. One of my colleagues who's at the US Access Board in the US said, born accessible approaches help with cost cutting. Remediation means rework. Rework is waste. So born accessible approaches reduce waste. That's how they are defining it to their colleagues, that this is not something that costs more. This is something that's money saving. To give an example of the types of advocacy in responding to a regulatory process, National Federation of the Blind of South Carolina says content would be born accessible and would not need to involve the waste of time and energy for remediation. The US Department of Justice in the US, in the new regulation, talks all about that they want universities and public education institutions to prepare to make course content accessible proactively instead of having to respond reactively. State of Maryland digital accessibility policy says you must ensure that technologies are born accessible, which eliminates the potential for costly remediation efforts and can result in cost savings. So this is really starting to appear all over the policy world in North America, right? This push for born accessible. It's also in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We want to promote the design, development, production, and distribution of accessible ICT at an early stage so that these technologies and systems become accessible at minimum cost. Article 21 talks about a timely manner without additional cost. ACM recently talked about this, the Association for Computing Machinery, in their tech brief, right? They talked about, in their Advancing Accessibility in the Digital World tech brief, addressing accessibility from the start of technology design and development. So there is this demand from governments, from professional organizations, right? From the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, from disability advocates, to move us more towards born accessible design. The question is, what does that mean? And that's really what our work is focusing on, and that is what I think as an HCI community we really need to take responsibility for. There are people asking for something that's HCI. We have the demand. We have people coming saying, we want to do this. How do we meet that demand? How do we get out there and meet the moment? And that's what I want to challenge us to do. So moving on to section 3, methods for born accessible design. There isn't really a fully defined methodology yet for born accessible design. And that's where we've been trying to fill the gap. And that's where I want to encourage as many of you as possible. And those of you in Zoom land, hello on Zoom land, right? I want to encourage you to focus on how can we define what this means, and how can we define what this means in our local context, in our country, in our local area, with the disability rights groups. So let's start with what it might mean. And I want to mention, I'm going to present a few different we'll say a few different models that we've created so far based on feedback from disability rights groups. These are all a work in progress. So just as a starting point, you will see it grow in this presentation. So we started in 2023 by asking disability rights groups and leaders of disability rights groups, an informal survey, what do you think it means? Because if people are asking for something, if people are demanding something, they must have some idea for what they think it means. They are demanding something, and that means there's an unmet need. And the question is, how do we move towards understanding and filling that unmet need? And so the first survey, informal survey we did of disability rights leaders in the US, right? And again, I want to expand this work to the UK as well. So if any of you here or any of you watching on Zoom say, I want to figure out exactly how to situate this in the UK, please talk with me, because that's one of the things I want to do is I want to expand this work to other countries and figure out what we can do, right, to ensure that we are understanding what this means in every context. So the disability rights leaders in the US said they think it means, their answer is clustered around 4 topics. Set clear accessibility goals from the start of a project. Include people with disabilities from the start of the design process. Coding to accessibility standards. And involving people with disabilities in user evaluation. Now, that was in 2023. I was very happy to see in August 2025, the Web Accessibility Initiative came out with an accessibility maturity model. Right? They call it the W3C Accessibility Maturity Model. All 4 of those concepts were in their accessibility maturity model. So those seem to be core concepts that there's general agreement on. So let's talk about what each of these 4 concepts means, and then we'll move on to some of the kind of the growth in the model over time. So, you know, one of the common misnomers that I often hear is, well, people with disabilities don't use our whatever software product content. Now, first of all, people with disabilities is a very, very broad umbrella involving perceptual, motor, cognitive disabilities, neurodiversity. And so we have to change the kind of the thought process. So people with disabilities are always your users. You're always going to have, for any content, any type of software, you're always going to have people with disabilities as your users. But it's important to think about splitting it up into, are there technologies that we are doing in-house, or are we contracting out? If you're contracting out, you can use procurements, legal documents, things like that. Right? How is it an assistive technology focused on people with disabilities, or is it a broad software operating system mobile app content? Right? Because it's really important that we focus on making sure everyone can use, or at least the largest number of people possible can use, whatever it is you're building. And it's not as if we don't know how to do many of these things. So I'll talk about these 4 core concepts while noting that most of these are things that we actually, at the individual step level, right, are things we've defined in HCI. So setting clear accessibility goals from the start of a project. What are ways to do that? Include accessibility checklists, include scenarios, include personas that involve people with disabilities. Again, if you're contracting for technology, use procurement, use indemnification clauses. What is an indemnification clause? I can put the lawyer hat on for a minute, right? An indemnification clause is when, if you are procuring technology, you put in a clause in there saying that if for any reason your organization is sued because the technology you procured is inaccessible, the vendor is on the hook, is liable, right? And that's really important, because if the vendor says, whoa, I won't do that, the question you can ask is what? Why not? Why? Why won't you do that? Do you think it's actually not accessible and you're just telling us it is? And you sometimes do have vendors who will, oh yeah, it's accessible. We do all the accessibility, right? And it's actually not accessible. So, you know, clearly define legal requirements. People often say, well, there's a law that says something. What's the law? Is it the Equality Act here in the UK? Be very clear what the, you know, in the US, are we talking about Title III of the ADA? Don't just say there is a law. As computer scientists, we sometimes do that. Rather than be specific as to what the requirements are legally. Train all members of your development team on accessibility. Now, the second one, include people with disabilities from the start of the design process. There's a great quote from Sarah Herlinger, Director of Accessibility at Apple. We've always incorporated members of the community into the process as we've done this. We believe in the mantra of the disability community of, and this is something hopefully most people should know, what's the mantra often of the disability community? Nothing about us without us. Right? So You can't design, as Sarah Herlinger said, you can't design a product that's really going to work for someone if you're on the outside looking in, and if you think you know how something's going to work. There was a news article recently talking about how only 1/3 of organizations directly engage with disabled people in digital accessibility efforts. Now, this is really important because people will say, oh, our organization does accessibility. Often what they mean is a very narrow definition of accessibility, talking about technical standards, right? And accessibility is much broader than just technical standards. So what are some techniques here, right? Hiring people with disabilities as developers, using participatory design methods and other co-design methods, having user advisory boards, having disability rights organizational advisory boards. This is something we've been doing at the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility, which is we have advisory boards of disability rights groups. And one of the benefits of working with the groups, because usually in HCI we typically think of working with individuals, we think of users, right? So you want to work with users with disabilities, which is great. Often the disability rights groups have a broader view. So they can represent more diverse than, one person, let's say, who's low vision and uses magnification, but may not have a good understanding of what it's like to use a screen reader, right? So if you work with like a blindness organization, you have people who have no residual vision, you have people with low vision who might use magnification, you have people who are deafblind. And so like working with the disability rights group gives you a broader insight into where the barriers might be. All of this is within the tradition of user-centered design. For people who've been doing HCI for years, nothing here should feel particularly foreign. So the third one of the 4 concepts, coding to accessibility standards. Hopefully this is something that most people are familiar with, right? You obviously are familiar with the EU standards, the UK standards, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, EN 301549. For content that is not necessarily web content, you've got EPUB 3 for books, PDF UA. You can apply the WCAG concepts to non-web technologies. I'm honored that Helen is in the audience here. Helen, I always mention this one because it's such a great, important paper. Guidelines are only half the story. Accessibility problems encountered by blind users on the web. It's a CHI 2012 paper, but the idea is that when people say, we use technical standards, we're good. And you saw that earlier in that news story, right? That a very few number of organizations actually engage with people with disabilities. They say, we code to standards. But from this work, right, we know that, they found only half of the problems encountered by users were covered by success criteria in WCAG. So standards is a floor. It's not a ceiling. And there was a similar finding from a paper by Azencott and their colleagues, how accessibility practitioners promote the creation of accessible products in large companies. Several participants viewed WCAG as a baseline measure of accessibility, which they ultimately sought to exceed. One participant said meeting WCAG was just a bare minimum. Another one said this minimum ensured you complied with regulations, but it didn't ensure you produced a usable product for people with disabilities. So standards are important, but they're only the beginning. That itself does not make it accessible. And then involving people with disabilities in user evaluations. So usability testing, I'm sure most of us are familiar with, but the idea is include a larger circle of people. Obviously, don't include the people who co-designed with you because they will already, be able, well, this was good, I helped design this, right? You need different users. You need a broader set of people with disabilities, have very clear inclusion criteria for who should be involved, no proxy users. Use the social model to understand the technology used. So people will often think if they're not familiar with working with people with disabilities and usability testing, I should ask about their visual acuity, or I should ask about a medical question. And I always say, no, ask what technology they use, right? We're not interested in the medical data. We're interested in what technologies are they able to use. And obviously, that'll give you insights. Distributed research is always better for people with disabilities because it takes out the transportation issues. You can generally get a broader representation of people as well. And here's an important question. We talk about this in detail in the research methods in HCI textbook. Do we use a consistent technology environment or a best case scenario? Now, since a lot of people who do HCI have a background or training that's a little bit experimental design-ish, right? We tend to say, well, we want to control for this. All of our participants will use the same technology, the same laptop, we're going to control, with people with disabilities, I say, use a different approach. Use the best case scenario. Let people with disabilities use their technology, their assistive technology with their settings, right? Because that's going to show them at their best. And often when you talk about accessibility barriers, what you're going to hear is, oh, it's not that bad, right? And so I always say go with the most conservative approach. Let people use the technology that they use on a daily basis with the right settings. So you see them at their best, and so you can say, actually, this is a very good representation of what daily life looks like for them. They are using their technology with their settings. So you remove that argument. And again, doing usability testing involving people with disabilities, plan for transport if they need to come to a center, right? Make sure it's accessible. Don't make last minute changes. They may have spent time planning out their transport. And interestingly enough, right, you can make modifications when you do usability testing. Again, we sometimes have this mindset because we learn about experimental design. You can't make changes. People have different needs. People with autism may need more breaks, right? People with certain cognitive impairments may say, I don't feel comfortable using like a fake account, someone else's name, right? As we typically do, your profile for this test study is you're Jane Smith, and here's your account marked Jane Smith, and you can use this to, right? Some people don't feel comfortable with that. One of my favorites was changing tasks. We were doing a usability evaluation involving people with Down syndrome and using calendaring tasks using a multi-touch screen. And we had said, please add to the calendar a 1 hour birthday party for Steve, like on Saturday, right, 1 p.m., 2 p.m. We had a participant who said, do you not like Steve? I said, I'm sorry. You only gave him a 1 hour birthday party. Why would you give someone only a 1 hour birthday party? I will not do this task unless you allow me to make it a 3 hour birthday party, because that's what Steve deserves. I'm like, okay. From our task point of view, it doesn't make a difference if it's 1 or 3. We're studying the interaction. We're studying can the person. But that's a perfect example where someone may want something a little bit different, and you can allow it. You can make modifications. It's okay. In fact, it's good practice, right? And that is a good question. Why are we giving someone a 1 hour birthday party? It's actually a question I wouldn't have thought of. So changing the format of the communication. Maybe you need to use sign language interpreters. Maybe you need to use Braille. Figure out what the needs are. Maybe it's, for instance, a visual Likert scale. Rather than saying on a scale of 1 to 9, you have like they have at the airport, right, in the loo. You've got from the, the smiley face, excellent, to the frowny face. That's fine too. Use a signature guide for people if, let's say, they're blind, to help them sign something if signing is required. So we've been working on this model, and so I want to start with, we've been doing these 2 projects. One is a project involving Adobe and Adobe Express, the tool, and one is a project involving the US Access Board and the General Services Administration. And we've been doing these 2 projects to better understand how these concepts, these 4 core concepts, might be applied. And from a paper that will be published soon in Interacting with Computers, we've now been able to expand this to 7 core concepts, right? And there are 3 new ones from our experience doing these projects in the 2 years. And they are institutionalizing equity in decision-making, legal and policy integration, and embedding accessibility throughout the development lifecycle, along with the 4 concepts we've already talked about in detail. Then in May 2025, we had a workshop at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. And again, this was US-based, bringing in disability rights activists, tech company leads, government officials, lawyers from all these different sectors for 3 days of intensive discussion about what do you think born accessible design means. And so we had leading representatives from Google, Microsoft, Adobe, disability rights groups like the National Federation of the Blind, American Association of Persons with Disabilities, Deaf Equality, the chief information accessibility officers in Minnesota and Maryland, US Access Board, the US's leading disability rights lawyer, who's at Brown Goldstein Levy. And so what did they think it meant, and how would they frame it? And again, we just keep asking in different settings. I want to expand this to other countries as well, because I think it will be different contextually. So there were some new things in this one as well. Continuous accessible now and forever. The disability rights groups were saying, one of the big problems is we work so hard to make something accessible, and they make modifications, and then it's not accessible. And how do we integrate that into born accessible? So born and always accessible, right? So have a documented plan for accessibility. People said this was really important, that you should have a documented accessibility plan, right? How do we ensure that we are actually building this to be accessible? How do we do that, right? What do we need to do for that? On by default. This was really important. How many people are familiar with just core concepts of behavioral economics? A little bit of behavioral econ. I can't see your hands on the Zoom universe. But so one of the core concepts of in terms of trying to do behavioral nudges in behavioral economics is that you try and structure a decision to push people to nudge them in the right direction. And they often talk about the difference between opt-in and opt-out, right? The difference between opting in, where you have to go find something and make a decision, and opting out, where the decision's kind of made for you and you can choose to opt out of it. So if you think of, for instance, retirement, right? If you are not automatically signed up for a retirement plan, the numbers of people would actually be pretty low for who actually goes and signs up for a retirement plan at a new job. But if people are defaulted to automatically go, right, and automatically be signed up for the retirement plan, it's a much higher number of people. So you can use, right, on by default notice, right, you can use behavioral economics to say accessibility features are always turned on. Any features for content creators are always turned on. And one of the concerns that disability rights groups said is they want to make sure that whatever assistive technology people use, this whole born accessible idea doesn't replace your assistive technology that you've bought and you've spent time learning and you spent time creating the right settings. So these are some core concepts of born accessible design. I want to stop for a minute before we move on to some of the research we've been doing on tool development. Just ask, are there any clarification questions about born accessible design, what we know so far? And by the way, I assume over time, these will change as we do more of these working groups and more disability rights groups are involved. This will change, but at least it helps us understand a little bit better. You know, some of the issues, by the way, are even related to like a power imbalance. These disability rights groups, right, say it's really important to us that we have a role in the decision-making of your products. And you sometimes get pushback from the tech companies who say, no, these are our products. You get no decision. And the disability rights groups are saying, you know, this is kind of the problem we've been having for years, right? We want to be part of the process. How do we get involved in the process? How do we become your partners in making sure that you only release products that are accessible and software and content? And, you know, in some organizations, some technology companies, some content creation companies, they may have a leading person like a chief information accessibility officer who really brings that to the forefront in the organization. But many organizations do not. So let me stop for a minute, ask any clarification questions about born accessible design before we move into the tools. Okay, so then we'll move on. So we've been working for about 2 years with Adobe and their product Adobe Express. Are people familiar with Adobe Express? It creates short form content. Just show of hands if you're in the room. If you're a little bit, or nodding. I see a lot of people are nodding. Okay, you've heard of it. You're familiar with it. And so one of the challenges of Adobe Express is it was released, the tool was inaccessible, so it's not really born accessible design, right? But also the content that it creates is inaccessible. And so Adobe approached us and said, we would like to work with you to figure out how can we make this tool create accessible content. So it's not really fully born accessible because the tool is released without being accessible, just to be clear. But the content it creates could be, because not many people have used it yet. There's the opportunity to change the tool to make it much easier to make content accessible. So what is Adobe Express? It's a browser-based design tool, broad audience, you know, anyone of any level of expertise. And our goal is to move from the remediation model. And think about how many tools you use that have a remediation model. Right? You make your PDF document and then you go back afterwards and maybe you fix it. Right? You get a complaint about something, you go back and fix it. Right? This is a problem. Our tools are, for the most part, designed, any content creation tools, any development tools, they're designed around a remediation model. By the way, even how we teach accessibility, which is often at the end of an academic program, right before, you know, you're about to graduate, that's the remediation approach. You learn how to do all these things. Oh, by the way, at the end, you should go back and fix these things. That's not the right approach to teach it. That's not the right approach for development. And so what we want to do, and what we want to do with this work, is figure out how do we move from the fix afterwards to integrating it into the workflow. So one way to think about it, how many people use the feature in Microsoft PowerPoint that will suggest alt text for you? It'll suggest alt text for your images, alternative text. A few people use that. So keep in mind, that's not really in the workflow and it's kind of hidden, right? It's a great feature, but it's hidden away. So you have to like really go look for it. It doesn't stop you and say, well, hold on, image here, right? Well, what are you going to do with this? How are you going to label this? So it doesn't really do that. And so when we talk about in the workflow, we're talking about as you are creating content. And here we're just talking about content, not sort of software development with this tool. But so we started with listening sessions with Adobe Express with disability rights groups. We invited every disability rights group that we're affiliated with. And people often say, how do you choose which ones you invite? That's a common question. Here's what I always say. We invite everyone on our mailing list and encourage them to forward it to anyone else that they know. We are completely open. If you want to come and have a voice, right, you can come and have a voice. And so we had 5 groups that came. An interesting question that arose is, so Born Accessible, you should have people with disabilities from the start. Can we use sketches to try to present concepts? Because, you know, we want to have sketches to be able to present ideas, but that means we weren't involving people with disabilities when we created the sketches. But on the other hand, having the sketches could facilitate the conversation. We asked, and they generally said, if it facilitates the conversation, but you haven't built anything, if they're just for ideas, that's okay. So, you know, some of the lessons we took from those listening sessions, as I already mentioned, the opt-out approach, make sure that the accessibility features are already enabled. Explain the why in the messaging. Most tools don't explain why accessibility is important. It doesn't explain it's a legal requirement. It doesn't explain how many people will be helped by this. Communicate time savings to users, right, of how much time you'll save by making the accessibility markup inserted now. And so we determined that within the Adobe Express workflow, there are really 3 different places, 3 different kind of stages where you could work on accessibility before, right, a file was exported. So first of all, some of the Adobe Express, some of the users were choosing templates. So I said, well, great, let's first start by making sure that we only have accessibility templates, right? Templates that are fully accessible. And this is actually where one of, I think, the challenges comes into play, where from a tech company point of view, tech companies say we want to give creators the authority to create whatever they want. And certainly you see this in some of the AI debates, right? And my question was, so what if they want to create white text on a white background? Completely unreadable, right? Is that okay? And the answer was, we empower content creators. So yes, if they want to create white text on a white background, that's their choice. As an accessibility advocate, I would believe in stopping people from making choices that are, completely inaccessible. But that's my bias. So one is at the template level. The other is as the content creator is creating content at that moment, right? Now, keep in mind, it's not only at that moment as they're typing in or inserting an image, but it could be opportunities for markup that occur maybe 2-3 seconds delayed. So for instance, if you put in a first item, maybe not noticeable, but once you put in a second item, oh, this might be an unordered list, right? There are opportunities that may occur 2-3 seconds after you insert content where the AI can pick up and say, oh, wait, this might be a list, this might be a whatever. And then once you're almost finished with the document before you export to another format, because once it's in another format, it will be much harder to change, you could stop and say, the following things have not yet had accessibility markup. Would you like to add them now? So we created an accessibility copilot focused on 3 things: alt text, color, tagging. And we had a little accessibility icon that notes the how many barriers exist, how many things need to be fixed, right? And how many then, once you fix them, the number goes down. But the key thing is that you want to encourage users, explain why. And these are actually approaches that have not yet been done in developer tools or content creation tools, right? It's like the alt text in PowerPoint. It's hidden away. You have to go look for it. It doesn't tell you why you're doing it. It doesn't tell you how many people it helps. It's not in your workflow. You have to opt in. What if we switch to make it much easier where there's a lot less friction in terms of adding accessibility markup? So what if we said, you could increase your audience by up to 30% more users? What if we let you know where the opportunities were? So part of this, again, communicating the why. It can increase your audience by up to 30% more users, right? And so when you actually integrate that into the workflow with the Copilot on the right, alt text, right? Express has automatically generated an alternative text caption. Is this accurate? Yes, right? Save, or give feedback that it's not, or maybe it's just decorative, right? It explains who it's for. And, you know, as I mentioned before, there's this difference between suggesting and forcing. as an accessibility advocate, I would believe in really forcing people to make content accessible. But tech companies generally aren't in that same comfort level. So for instance, this example here with color contrast. And notice that, right, it's picked up that there's an accessibility barrier. So the accessibility counter up there has 1 because add text does not have sufficient color contrast. It is dark blue on like a medium blue background. Not enough color contrast. So Adobe Express will now suggest to you some that are accessible and some that are not as alternatives. And so the ones that are accessible have the accessibility icon. But that's a really important point about, it's a societal goal for accessibility, right? There are legal requirements. But yet we still have development tools that kind of say, you can do what you want, right? I mean, I want to know, why is it we don't have security features that say, well, look, Jonathan, you really don't like passwords. We're going to allow you just to use your first name as a password. Like, I want that right. I want that right to use a password that's not secure. Do we say that's okay? No, right? The requirement is you use a secure password of a certain length and with uppercase and lowercase. Why are we allowing inaccessibility? We know this isn't okay. We know this is bad color contrast. We want to empower you. Please empower me with really insecure passwords. Right? Just think about that. How many areas of HCI do we not empower users to do what they want? Why is it in accessibility we empower users to just do what they want, even if it hurts other people? Something to think about. Now, as soon as you select a color contrast that is where there's a sufficient one, right, then the accessibility counter up there goes back to 0, right? Contrast increased. So we've already done a small study involving the color aspects. And one of the most interesting things to me, years ago, I was the digital accessibility chair for CHI, and it was CHI 2014 in Toronto. And one of the things we did is if your paper was accepted, you got a notification, here are your accessibility barriers in the paper. And only about 1/3 of the people who received information about the barriers actually made changes. Right? Gareth Tigwell and his colleagues found something very similar about, even if you're aware of color guidelines, often only about 1/3 of people actually applied them. So the question is, if you know about it and you're told about it and you still don't make the changes, what does that mean? That means that there's friction in applying it and actually doing it. And the question is, how do we build tools that have less friction, that allow people to actually make those changes easily? So just on the color guidelines aspect of it, we had qualitative feedback from 8 designers comparing the remediation approach to our Born Accessible approach prototype. And they actually liked it. They said it's more streamlined. It helps you walk through your project flow quicker. It does a better job explaining to me what the issues are and conduct the actual tasks. I like how it's instantly updating. You don't stop what you're doing. It's disruptive, but in a good way, helping me fix an issue. And obviously, one of the next steps is for the rest of the prototypes, we're going to do formal usability testing. And we're waiting right now on IRB approval to do so. So that will be our next step. And we've just mocked up some ideas about, once we've gotten to the point where the content's finished, and then we're getting to the, okay, you're about to export, what could we do there? So maybe a warning check here, right? Again, reminding people, making your document accessible can help you reach 30% more users. But note that in all the other prototypes, we didn't include like the warning label. We want it to be seamless in the flow and helpful, but not sort of the warning label. So some of the kind of key takeaways here. As I talked about, opt out, have accessibility as default. Now, do I believe maybe we shouldn't even allow people to opt out? Yes, but that's not going to be tech industry practice. But don't select it as opt-in where you have to look for it. Make it so it's already selected and accessibility is engaged. Explain the why, communicate time savings, put it in the workflow. Don't have lots of dialog boxes. As I mentioned, we are doing usability testing next. So what are the next steps we need to understand born accessible design? We need to gain more agreement from disability rights groups in other countries, not just the US, about what it means to them. Has it tie in with their national laws, right? What are the methods they think are appropriate? What's effective? What meets local, cultural? One of the examples I often give is that people often think Americans are litigious. Every time I hear about accessibility, it's a lawsuit. And that's actually because that's the way American law is structured. We don't have government watchdogs that are overseeing all this, right? If you're a disability rights group and you believe that there are accessibility barriers, the law is structured to encourage you to enforce your rights in court. right? That's a cultural and legal aspect, right? So obviously, I think that the way that a legal framework is structured in a different country, the role of local disability rights groups, what their kind of history has been, what their impact is, who they partner with, all those things have an impact on what it means to involve people with disabilities, right? Because we want to have an open door where tech companies want to work, and it's relatively low friction to work with disability rights groups. So we need to collect data on the benefits and the costs of born accessible design. We need to evaluate all these different activities. I mean, we're using listening sessions and usability testing and involving people with disabilities from the start and going back to groups, but we need to evaluate which activities, tools, and methods are going to be the most effective. We need to develop educational materials. We need to understand, we still haven't really defined fully accessibility and usability and how they relate. When we say accessibility, do we mean a broad accessibility of born accessible? Do we mean a narrow one of standards? Do we mean something in between? Do you mean standards plus usability testing? We need to have more projects, more prototypes on born accessible design. But I say it's very exciting to be at this point where there are all of these government policies, there are all of these advocacy groups who say, we need more HCI. We want this. We need this. This is important. We believe this could help what they're saying by demanding it is, we believe this could help our lives. So I want to challenge the HCI community to focus on better understanding born accessible design, right? Models, methods, tools, involvement, local context. I want everyone working together to move us to a place where when people ask, what does this mean? We say, here's what it means. I want to thank you all for your time today, and I look forward to questions. Go for it.
Yeah, I know. But I was just thinking, it reminded me of when I first started at UCLIC many years ago. I had to teach interaction design, and I remember reading Inmates Running the Asylum, and it, in a nutshell, it's the same kind of argument I think that you see through this line of work, which is basically it's an empathy problem. People are terrible at taking other people's position, and I think that's kind of in a way what this kind of work agenda is. What I'm seeing, it's kind of encourage. The whole point of that argument there is that developers shouldn't be allowed to make tools only for other developers. And the whole point of then of user-centered design was to get regular people involved, right? Because then it kind of gets them out of their own mindset and thinking, because they're blind to the things that they're failing to design for. And that's what I see you're kind of advocating for here. And that's good. But yeah, it's so then as a result, it's no great surprise. You talk about Gareth's finding that like a third of people just shrug their shoulders. And yeah, because I think people's natural reaction is that I'm all right, Jack, right? What's the problem? I'm good. I'm going to move on to my next thing.
People actually make the changes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it's no great surprise. Two-thirds just couldn't care less, right? Because I'm okay, mate. And I think that's depressingly a fairly common reaction of many. So yeah, that's the kind of agenda, isn't it? To try and get people to take it seriously. I suppose the interesting place really comes to when you get to the trade-offs, right? You can make it better for one group, but then, it's what you're describing there with the kind of thing, getting the different contrasts, that kind of suits everyone to kind of get those contrasts better. But it becomes more interesting when you've you're fixing for one people, but then that kind of makes it. So I remember Christophe Gaillard's had that really nice paper, Supple, where they talked about the kind of trade-offs that might exist in accessible design choices. As you fix for one subgroup, you end up hurting another, or what the solution is for one group is not the same as the other. I think that's potentially where it gets more interesting. So yeah, I think it's a great talk. Thank you. I think both the problem of getting people to take this seriously, and I think, even for just making our own slides or making our own Kai papers, it's hard to do this. The tools help, but then it's the kind of where the action is at to try and get that encouragement. So not a question, but more a collection of thoughts.
Interesting insights. Thank you for those comments. For one thing about if you help it for one group, does it harm other groups? There are very few scenarios where that. Oh, sorry, Helen, you want to go ahead? I'll let you comment on that.
No, I was going. One of the things that I was going to say that I've encountered very, very few scenarios where helping one group hinders another group.
Right.
It is possible, and I have had a couple, but not many. The other thing that I think is interesting is there are some surprising overlap. So with color contrast and presentation of text, if you help people who are low vision, you help people who are dyslexic, and that surprises developers. But
Yeah.
I was going to make another comment. When you talk about education, that strikes me, and there may be cultural differences here because, as you know, I've worked a lot with, we would call them organizations of disabled people. We don't have,
Like DPOs?
yeah, we don't have rights organizations in this country very much. But they're not very good at advocating for people with for their people in technology companies. I think they need to be educated, and it's kind of a HCI light, how to be a good participant, how to advocate. And that's our responsibility to teach them how to do this. Perhaps in the States it's different. And the other people who I think need education, and that's reviewer 2, because I've just had a paper rejected. Now, it wasn't a very good paper. It was by one of my students, and I wasn't surprised it was rejected. But one of the comments, which made me really cross, was they said, you let disabled people use different you let visually impaired people use different screen readers. That's not right. You have to make them all use the same screen reader. And I thought, have you ever actually talked ever to a blind person? So education.
Also great. So I will mention, Helen, you can always, in refuting reviewer 2 there, you can always cite our research methods in HCI book, 2nd edition, has a whole section about this and why making everyone use the same screen reader is not the best approach for research. So you can cite that and you can give them my phone number. And then you tell them, call John, they'll tell you they're wrong. But it's all the points that you're making are very interesting. So first of all, obviously, I agree very much with you that there are very few things that actually will harm one group. Usually, if you do one thing, so even if you think about the idea that people who are blind or low vision may not be able to use a pointing device, not because they can't physically grasp it, but because maybe they can't see on the screen where it would be pointing to. So if you make it accessible in that way, it also helps people who have some type of motor impairment where they couldn't use a pointing device by making it keyboard friendly. So there are often 2 or 3 groups at minimum who are helped by this for anything you do. And there's also a lot of research about the fact that people in general without any disabilities are often helped by things that improve the accessibility, that it just helps broader usability. So there's actually a lot. Accessibility really does help everyone. The difference is often that people with disabilities have legal rights in various countries that establish you have a legal right to be able to use it, whereas as general users, we often don't have a sort of legal right to be able to use it. Yeah, come on, go for it.
Thanks for a stimulating and very excited talk. My point is about following on from Duncan, education. When we teach our students about accessibility and disability, they get very excited. And then when they come to do their student projects, we say, sorry, you can't work with vulnerable people. You can't, it takes too much for us to get through the ethics. So they're put off and they don't get exposed to people with various kinds of disabilities. And then most they can get is through proxy. They might talk to someone who represents. So by the time they go to the world of work, they haven't had any access or training. And I wondered if, you could maybe advocate as well that we don't have to have this heavy load of ethics before you can start to work with these people. Why is it that we are so worried and frightened about, let's put it in quotes, vulnerable people when they really want to be, being treated and become equal and participate? So what do you say about that dilemma we have?
That's a great question. So I think that one of the reasons we often run into barriers is because of the mistreatment of people with disabilities in the past. And so part of the reason why, they set these barriers to us working with people with disabilities as co-researchers or whatever, is that in the past, there are many university researchers who have harmed people with disabilities. You can almost see that in the AI data double problem, which is that so many people with disabilities are worried about having data that identifies their disability status because that data has been used so much in the past to harm them and to discriminate against them, which is why we also then don't have data from people with disabilities represented in the data sets that drive our systems for AI. So there's this long history, and I think the thing that we can do from an education point of view, the thing that we can do from a researcher point of view, start reaching out to disability rights groups, DPOs, as you were saying they're called here, and start to form long-term partnerships. Right? Because one thing that the groups don't like is if you just call up, hey, I need some people of X for category Y for this. Nope. go to their meetings, engage with people before there's anything you need, and ask, what are your needs? And that's part of this in Born Accessible Design, right? What are the needs of people with disabilities? Establish that at the center, right? The people with disabilities. And so you can imagine it might be different if, for instance, you then approach your university ethics review committee and say, there's a letter here from this disability rights group. They say we've worked with them as a trusted partner for 10 years, and they want us to go ahead. This is a priority for them. And that might change the discussion a little bit. But it's setting up those long-term partnerships. And, we unfortunately often in research tend to think very short-term about, I have this paper, there's a deadline, this conference, this research, right? A student needs to graduate. Rather than say, I want to build long-term partnerships with these groups to help better meet their needs and to do work that is societally relevant. And this, for me, is what's so interesting about this topic of born accessible design, right? This has clearly been declared a priority by disability rights groups in the US, right? By government policies. So we're not saying, I think this is interesting. I think I want to do this research. I mean, I do think it's interesting, but it's that other people have defined that this is really important. And it gets back to the doing something societally useful, right? And figuring out where is the demand. And there is demand, right, from groups and from policies. And, the important thing is to build these long-term relationships. And I think that will help with doing some of the research, because then you have long-term partners. You don't want to do a one and done that doesn't work well with people with disabilities. You want to set up 10, 15, 20-year-long partnerships with the university, with the research group, and try to use that then to say, we are a trusted partner, but also we listen. If a group comes to us and said, there is this really important question, I want you to go investigate this, right? I'll give you an example. So you had mentioned the law degree. When I went back for the law degree at the University of Pennsylvania Law School in Philadelphia, not Penn State, by the way. So if any of my friends watch, they'll be angry otherwise that I didn't say Philadelphia. So when I went back for the law degree, I was taking an election law class. And, you have to write a paper. And I went to the professor and I said, so there's this need that exists in Maryland. Could I maybe do this instead? Like, instead of writing the paper, here's what I want to do, because there's this real world need that exists related to understanding ballot marking devices. And he said, sure, but you need to make it longer than the paper. I said, that's totally fine, right? But I knew that there was a need, and I wanted to address that need. And it was a need that came from the disability rights community. That was something that I wanted to do my best to address. And I think that there are many times where we need the disability rights groups, individuals with disabilities, and the groups. They know what's important to them. They know where their priorities lie. I mean, they have a limited amount of resources, so they spend a lot of time prioritizing, here are our big issues of employment or education or technology. They know what's important to them. The question is, are we going to engage as academics with the groups and say, help me understand what's important to you so I know what to work on in a way that it's beneficial for you? And I think that's really the best approach.
End on, but just like to thank you again for a very good and excellent talk, and I hope we all take heed of what you're saying. Born again.
Thank you.
You'll be around if any of you want to continue and ask further questions or have a conversation. So, and then some of us are going to Birkbeck at 5 to say goodbye to Vanessa, and Jonathan will be joining us there, so you get a chance to catch up there or now. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.